The whole of this strange adventure began with a peculiar electronic mail message I received several weeks ago, posted to my website's address. Since the early days of the World Wide Web, the project I directed, Failure Institute, had been online primarily as a work, and also as a sort of clearinghouse for those concerned with the ongoing failure. It had received some notice, and if possible to judge from the mail generated, both positive and negative, was visited by all sorts. This message was short and different. I have visited your ephemeral Failure Institute. I have also been to the physical beach of which you dreamt and can lead you there. I await your visit. I knew immediately what dream the writer was referring to. For some time now there was posted at Failure Institute a text, several pages in length, which described a vivid dream I'd had in Geneva. I won't retell the entire dream here, but perhaps this short excerpt will explain my interest in the mysterious email message. I found myself walking along a broad and sloping beach of sand, oddly silent, with no crying seabirds or rhythmic pulse of the surf, just a low and steady moan of wind. On my left I sensed a sharply rising cliff. I turned to look out to sea and was quickly overcome by vertigo, causing a drop to one knee. The beach fell sharply away in front of me. There was no sea. In its place, thousands of feet below me, a wide plain stretched out to a horizon lost in the distance. To regain my balance, I shifted and looked back over my shoulder to the cliff, which was now not a cliff at all, but a towering, glacier-flanked rocky peak. I realized I was halfway up the side of some huge mountain. Above me were stars and a sky so deep blue it seemed almost black, and yet the warm light of a rising or perhaps setting sun was still strong. Below, and for as far as I could see, the plain was covered with vast, swarming armies of people. All religions, all political persuasions, all causes, and each swirling under its symbol and warring with the other. When at last I pulled my gaze from this beautiful, horrible tableau and looked again to the peak, I saw instead a perfect equilateral triangle, radiating golden in the fading sun and rising from a base beyond my peripheral vision to a point that must surely have been beyond the oxygen. I awoke in tears with a great sense of longing. Feeling at the time the dream might have some significance for me, I wrote it down. Soon I was able to dismiss it as having been caused by nicotine withdrawal during a failed attempt to quit smoking. I read the note again. My initial reaction was uneasiness. Although flattered by the interest, I knew that the writer of the email was taking my dream seriously and was even offering to take me to a place I considered imaginary. This short note from a stranger set off a chain of disturbing questions about my path that I had hoped were successfully buried beneath a thick, comforting blanket of contemporary irony. In my youth I had been a mountaineer, a climber in the purest sense. I knew what the mountain in my dream signified. 30 years of smoking had made me a solid companion of altitude sickness, a companion I could nod to when asked to go climbing. With the coming of the new millennium, I had been re-exploring some of the more spiritual thoughts of those early days. An idea that stayed strong was that of the sacred mountain, found in every religious tradition. The idea that a rock and ice mountain exists somewhere on the planet, providing a physical link between earth and heaven, body and spirit. To function as this link, the mountain would have to be visible and accessible to the average human, not just an enlightened guru. To believe in the existence of a mountain many times higher than Everest still undocumented in this age of satellites and holographic maps, seems, of course, absurd to me now. But what if the mountain weren't always there, or didn't assume its true proportions until certain conditions were met? Historical conditions? Spiritual readiness? As all of these thoughts came flooding in, I realized that at the heart of it was the mysterious email. I felt that the writer, a stranger to me I had to assume, somehow knew my private mountain theories and more. I resolved to visit my new correspondent and replied to the message that very day. I was certain that a few hours with this eccentric, a few hours would assuage my guilt about avoidance of things mystical, and I could get back to comfortable, rational, contemporary art. The address Herr Doctor had given me was not too distant from my own home, and with the weather being fine the following day, I chose to walk. The house at number 22 DeMall Lane was an odd wooden structure, a two-story shingled affair. Taller than it was broad, it seemed more a tower. On the entrance was tacked a small card which read, Herr Doctor, Professor of Mountaineering, Lessons by Appointment. For access, use the rope. Next to the door hung a nylon climbing rope and affixed to it 2 ascending slings and a safety harness. While I was certain there existed, just inside that door, a perfectly good set of stairs, I chose to indulge my host in what seemed a harmless amusement and struggled my way up the rope to a second-floor window. As I climbed through the window and my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the man I was seeking, working at a small table, turning to greet me and rising to welcome me. The room was tiny and its walls were covered with maps, symbols, snippets of knowledge illustrated by image or text, and spirals, everywhere spirals. Once seated, we naturally began talking about mountaineering. I was immediately charmed by his easy manner. You and I must get to know each other in the next few hours, Herr Doctor said, in a voice that held traces of an Eastern European accent. I'm confident that soon we'll embark on a great adventure. We hold a certain belief in common. I asked him about his message and, of course, the meaning of the beach. It is an actual place, he said, a plateau at the 3,000-meter level on the north side of Mount Shasta. We will go there and see how much of your dream is true. I'm sure this dream was more a vision, he said with a smile. Herr Doctor told me of his many climbs of the mountain, how its proximity was the main reason for his moving here. He told me stories and legends dating back thousands of years, fantastic tales that made it clear, to him anyway, Mount Shasta was perhaps the sacred mountain. Herr Doctor, earlier you said we held a belief in common. What belief is that? Why, we both believe in hopelessness, he replied, in the ability of hopelessness to reveal great truths. He rose and began an animated discourse on the physical sciences. Now, you are no doubt aware of new research in quantum mechanics, the behavior of subatomic particles, nanotechnology, superstring theory. Science, pure science, is now poised to converge with more esoteric and ancient ways of perception. We will soon have rational, scientifically observable magic. Thankfully, a dinner bell ringing from below interrupted us. "Vengo subito," Herr Doctor called down the stairs. "Are you hungry? We'll continue this conversation over lunch." I followed Herr Doctor into a warm and bright first-floor room. Filled with plants of all types, it seemed more a conservatory. We seated ourselves at a small round table in the room's center, and he filled both our glasses. Behind me, the only works of art in the room, 2 German expressionist woodcut prints, the 7 Deadly Sins and the Totentanz. "Now here, this is something real," Herr Doctor began. "A simple pasta, a good red wine. My housekeeper, an Italian woman, cooks these wonderful meals using only the most natural ingredients." "When you say something real, what?" I began to ask. "I mean, a real spaghetti is worth more than a false philosophy." "Tell me," he said quietly, "have you ever had a near-death experience?" After catching my breath, I began to tell Herr Doctor of my time at sea. On Christmas Eve 30 years ago, the crab boat I was working on was capsized by a 15-meter wave while crossing the bar. The skipper and I were trapped in a tiny dark airspace. With so much debris blocking the way, my attempts at escape were futile. There seemed nothing to do but wait for the death that was sure to come, when the ship broke up and sank completely. "Did you pray? Was there panic?" Herr Doctor asked. "I did call out for some sort of divine intervention," I answered. "I thought that if ever there was a time, but there was nothing, just a pure clarity and calmness." "Perhaps that was the answer," Herr Doctor said. After lunch, we returned to the upstairs room, where Herr Doctor lit a cigarette. "We'll meet again next week," he said. "I know several people I would like to include in such an expedition. You may also know of someone. Next week I'll explain more of my theories and answer any lingering questions you may have." Herr Doctor laughed and closed his eyes, and I sensed our first meeting was at an end. I walked home trying to put all of Herr Doctor's information in perspective. My wife, with feet firmly on the ground, would have good advice, and I thought about how best to explain it all to her. I told my wife as concisely as I could the details of Herr Doctor's strange ideas and plan. While I liked him and might well accompany him on this quest, I didn't seriously believe any of what he had told me. "It seems the most fascinating idea I've heard in years," she said. "I am definitely going with you." I felt I was falling from a great height, falling to the summit slopes of a huge mountain. The following week, my wife and I traveled to the home of Herr Doctor for the scheduled meeting. His other guests had already arrived, and our first few minutes were busied with introductions and greetings. Judith Falk, a well-regarded local painter specializing in plein-air mountainscapes. I thought her work was very accomplished and would sell well if not for the tiny winged people She always depicted peeking out of crevices or from behind rocks. We had shared a laugh several years earlier when I told her I could identify with her work, since we were both so concerned with pixels. She claimed to only paint what she saw. Lawrence Pepperwood, a computer professional who moved to the area in the early 1970s, author of a collection of sonnets about his Vietnam experience. He was host of a website called 2019.com. Currently at work on a book concerning the singularity. Millie Cutton, a fifth-generation local resident. Years earlier she'd been a stage actress in the city. Now she was known for her Sunday salons held in her Victorian mansion. She never said a word during this meeting, which, as I understood, was in character. Herr Doctor referred to her smile as being capable of inspiring the most forlorn party onto the summit. My wife, a writer currently providing half the family income by working as a reporter for the local television station. I could attest to her climbing skills as she had continued on alone to the summit of a peak in the Bugaboo Range we had chosen to climb on our honeymoon, while I, pulverized by altitude sickness, remained in the tent. Myself and, of course, Herr Doctor, our leader. Herr Doctor began telling a story. In the fall of 1881, local hunter, scout, and Civil War veteran Lewis Quimpson was leading a small group of homesteaders from Sacramento into the Scott Valley region west of Mount Shasta. All proceeded well as the travelers made their way up the Central Valley until the point when the mountain dominates the horizon. In a statement made to authorities after the incident, Watson, a sheep rancher with the group, recalled, "Mr. Quimpson began acting most erratically, with pacing, constant glancing toward the peak, and whispering to himself. Although their guide had a reputation as a temperate man, several of the women felt he had taken to the bottle." Quimpson's odd behavior culminated at a stop near the present location of the city of Weed, when witnesses reported that between bouts of crying, laughing, and muttering in tongues, he scrawled directions for the homesteaders on a map, mounted his horse, pointed to Mount Shasta and said, "I must climb home," then rode off. The following evening, from their campsite above Stewart Springs, the homesteaders watched a huge cloud form above a Mount Shasta bathed in the rich glow of sunset. Quoting from Rancher Watson's statement again, "Like a huge golden triangle pointing up, the cloud lasted from sunset until well into dark night." "The lenticular clouds of Mount Shasta are well documented," Herr Doctor said, bringing us back from his story. "Let me show you some photographs." He passed a set of small prints around the group. A cloud might well explain it all, but no trace was ever found of Mr. Quimpson. I mean no offense to those residents of Hawaii or the state of Alaska when I say we are as far away as one can get, as far away as possible from the machines of capital, the engines of success. Allow me to illustrate. And he went to the blackboard. Here are the basic shape of this land, a country formed by those unable to succeed in Europe, by immigrants, refugees, by those seeking to get away, by those seeking. One starts on the East Coast. It becomes too much like what came before, a fresh start further west, another chance, pushing on ever westward, until finally, we are as far away as one can get. What better place for a sacred mountain, a link between earth and heaven? I first heard tales about this peak while bivouacking in the Caucasus Range, if you can imagine. Stories of odd occurrences on Shasta's north side told by an English climber while roped together on Mount Robson convinced me to move here, eke out a living giving mountaineering lessons, and wait to find the right climbing party. Now, after many years and many ascents of that peak, I am sure I know the right route and have the right group of companions. There was animated discussion amongst Herr Doctor's audience. We all had vital questions. Mr. Pepperwood wished to know why we had each been selected. "I'll try to explain as well as possible," Herr Doctor replied. "Keep in mind that you have a reputation as a strong climber, tenacious on glacier ice. All your questions will be answered quite naturally as our journey progresses." I spoke of my research concerning failure, in which I had heard tales of the local people thousands of years ago making small spherical clay vessels left as offerings on the high slopes of Mount Shasta. My interest had been piqued when I discovered they had called them failures, referring to a belief that upon completion, a world, a star, a universe collapses into itself, perfecting itself in a tiny sphere, perfecting itself in its own failure. Herr Doctor confirmed that he had heard many of the same stories, and added that there was the possibility some of these objects might be found during our climb. It was hard to know what price this rare pre-Columbian artifact might fetch, but certainly such a find could help allay some of the costs of the expedition. Herr Doctor drew a line on the blackboard and said, "Our aim must be to set a base camp on an isolated plateau at the 3,000-meter level of Mount Shasta's north side, a location rarely visited as it sits between the two main climbing routes on that part of the mountain, the Hotlam Glacier route to the east and the Bolam Glacier route. We'll camp here, a serene sheltered area, flat and covered in fine sand, which, the first time I visited, reminded me of being on an expansive beach." Herr Doctor glanced at me with a slight smile. "According to my calculations, this beach is exactly in the center of Mount Shasta when viewed from true north. And from that same northerly position, a line drawn vertically through our campsite will pass through the highest point on the summit. We'll make our camp and plan on several days of acclimatization and careful scientific observation of natural phenomena as we await formation of the perfect cloud." "I have climbed Mount Shasta several times," Lawrence Pepperwood said. "Always from the south, it's true, but still the same mountain. I have never witnessed anything out of the ordinary. Certainly nothing such as you are suggesting. Exactly what are we hoping to—" "No, not hope," Herr Doctor interrupted. "Hope with its preconceived visions will only obscure. Our shared familiarity with failure will guide, allowing us to see routes others have overlooked." "Failure is no great achievement," said Pepperwood. "I've accomplished it more than once." "Of itself, no," said Herr Doctor. "I agree. But to continue on our climb with full understanding that there is no hope of success, now that is something. I've made arrangements for transportation through an acquaintance of mine. We'll all travel together. There's a full moon in 2 weeks' time. Climbing conditions should be ideal with the possibility of lenticular cloud formation at its height. So then, get your affairs in order, gather your climbing equipment and personal supplies, and we leave in the morning, a fortnight from now." Herr Doctor had indeed secured transportation for the group, an older station wagon that appeared to be the service vehicle for a commercial fishing boat. We left the waterfront district of the city and headed east, initially through the dense redwood forests near the sea, and then along the banks of the river that formed a path to the interior, bisecting the coastal mountain range. Within a few hours, the landscape we drove through changed dramatically. Brilliant sun on red earth with muted dry brush and oak predominating. The air temperature rose to nearly double that of the coast. Herr Doctor drove quickly but smoothly and kept up an amiable patter about flora and fauna alongside the highway. Inside, the high temperature abetted by the tight packing of 6 adults and all their gear into the station wagon began to wear on the group. There were several arguments about the smallest of things, caused, no doubt, by the uncomfortable traveling conditions. Millie Cutton spoke up on one occasion to head off what could have developed into a fight about body odor between Mr. Pepperwood and myself. With considerable travel time in the cramped car still ahead of us, Herr Doctor chose to begin telling one of his tales as a distraction. As soon as he mentioned Lemurians, my eyes rolled in their sockets and it was all I could do to restrain a protest. I get the willies when people include supernatural beings in the discussion of metaphysics. Whether tiny, gigantic, covered with fur, or green, their inclusion is always to the detriment of serious consideration of topics that, aside from the power of their universality, have a special place in my heart. I chose, in a decision that could have been affected by my position as a member of a captive audience, to allow that Herr Doctor was speaking metaphorically, remained silent, and listened as I gazed out the window. The climber awoke before dawn from a fitful sleep and noticed immediately his partner's absence. The tent flap was partially unzipped, allowing a fine dusting of spindledrift near the opening, glittering in the flashlight's beam. As he stuck his head out to locate his friend, he saw not 3 meters distant a very tall man with hair of biblical length, oddly dressed in white robes. The climber recalled that the strange man welcomed him and bid him to follow. As they walked together across the snow in silence, the climber was quite comfortable even though he knew he had not put on his parka and felt certain his boots were still in the tent. They entered the Bergschrund and soon turned down a sloping shaft which seemed man-made and heading to the heart of Mount Shasta. At once the shaft opened into a large chamber, lined in gold and lit from within. The strange man said he was a Lemurian, and that these were his living quarters. He explained that the mountain was filled with shafts and caves housing thousands of his people. The climber was invited to rest on a slab of solid gold, which radiated warmth and felt like the softest goose down. Later they could travel together to meet other Lemurians and learn much of this ancient civilization. But first, he was told, if he would just lay his head upon this pillow of gold. It might well have been the mention of that golden pillow, but for whatever reason I drifted off to sleep at this point. After what I suspect must have been several hours, I woke to a completely different landscape. The air was fresh and cool, and the road an unpaved track across sand and brush. In the sky, small puffy white clouds above a horizon that held my first view of our mountain. "We are in the high desert just to the north of Mount Shasta," Herr Doctor said when he noticed I was awake. "Not too much further to the trailhead. The air is much nicer now, don't you agree?" I did agree and said so, although I added that the road was much worse. I was happy for the seatbelt and hung on to whatever I could as we bounced up the dirt track. He nodded and said, "Normally one would want four-wheel drive for this, but as long as we can keep the speed up and not damage the oil pan by bottoming out, we'll be fine." As we climbed higher up the slope, for the first time during the drive I began to worry whether the old station wagon could make it. The road had deteriorated to not more than a jeep trail, with cavernous ruts and huge boulders that had to be negotiated. Everyone was wide awake by now and looking about with that combination of apprehension and excitement that seems to accompany such rides. Herr Doctor stopped the car at the end of the road, and the huge cloud of dust that had been following close behind engulfed us and then settled. The air was clear and smelled sweetly of pine, a smell that only occurs in the evening after the forest has baked all day. The group happily went about all the chores necessary to make camp in the hour of light remaining. Besides the beauty of the location and the anticipation of the climb, we were all delighted to be out of that car and standing upright. "We hike from here on," Herr Doctor explained to Pepperwood. "We should be very grateful that the automobile brought us to the 2,000-meter level." At the end of the first day of our adventure, there was a sundog in the west, a beautiful sight, regarded throughout history as portending wondrous things to come, or perhaps an omen of doom. One or the other. I can't remember. After Herr Doctor's assurances that the climb to establish a first camp on the beach would neither be long nor strenuous, we chose to sleep in, enjoy a slow and restful breakfast, and begin our climb through the forest at mid-morning. When exhaustion was complete and we desperately needed a rest, Herr Doctor was already there waiting for us, relaxing and smoking a cigarette. After several hours, we rose above the tree line and got a sense of Mount Shasta. Ahead and above, glimpses of the peak through mountain effect clouds. One last steep scramble up a loose rock and scree slope. Finally cresting, then a gentle walk across level ground to our campsite. Shedding my pack, I scrambled to the top of the volcanic boulders that formed a natural wall around the beach. The view back down over our route to the valley seemed strangely familiar. Herr Doctor explained mountain effect clouds to Millie Cutton and what conditions would be propitious for the formation of lenticular clouds. The first camp was established and there was a bit of free time for relaxation. In his wanderings about the beach, Lawrence Pepperwood discovered one of the hollow ceramic spheres we had been hoping to find. The failure was passed among the group, but no decision was reached as to whether we ought keep it or not. Judith Falk, our group's painter, spent an hour doing preliminary sketches for her portfolio of images documenting our expedition. With afternoon clouds scudding near the summit, Herr Doctor called a meeting on the beach to discuss climbing safety, rope team assignments, ice axe arrest technique, our route, and above all, our attitude. After the meeting, I chose to explore our beach, taking observations and making notes regarding the variety of rock formations and, although very limited, the exotic plant life existing at this altitude. I chanced upon 2 insects mating. Certainly they could not be native to this region. I saw no way they could survive for long in this world that, with its lack of vegetation and freezing overnight temperatures, seemed so hostile. Yet they continued with this the most important act of their short lives, oblivious to the sure fact of its doomed outcome. Perhaps they had been born aloft, already united by some errant wind.
It is at this point Mount Shasta ends, in the middle of a chapter, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a word. My husband interrupted his work to have a drink with an old friend who stopped by. Later that same day, he left for a scheduled trip to New York. His death came as a surprise, and sadly, he left no notes or outline for finishing this photonovella. I did find this one quote neatly tacked on the wall above his desk, and it may be appropriate here.